Got it. Perfect. So today we got the first ever Moment Mentorship webinar series, and I'm just going to be talking about developing a model for movement and why it's important. And we're going to be going over principles, heuristics, and methods, a framework for making decisions, functional movement patterns, scalable training solutions, how to develop a model and its importance. I'm going to be breaking down one of the functional movement patterns, and I'm going to be showing you how I implement developing a model with that specific movement pattern. So let's get after it. A little bit about me. I'm from Queens, New York, got my bachelor's in psychology from University of Buffalo, DPT from University of St. Augustine. I've been in academic probation a ton of times, failed at a lot of things, never truly passionate about anything besides sneakers until discovering movement and rehab. So this has been like my bread and butter ever since. Done a lot of different continuing education. Love learning, tacos, beer. That's my puggle on the right. His name's Oliver, and founder of Moment PTP and Mentorship. So within the mentorship, I always love to add quotes because I think certain quotes just resonate and give you so much emotion behind them. This is a quote from Edward de Bono, and he's a physician. Complexity means distracted effort. Simplicity means focused effort. And I think it's very easy in the health and fitness industry to make things complex for the sake of making it complex. And the goal for me has always been like, how can I do this and create changes and give people a positive experience without making things so complicated, right? Because if I can't even talk to another trainer or another coach or a clinician and communicate what I'm doing, how can I expect someone that's seeing me with no background to understand what I'm doing? So for me, I'm always trying to distill things down to make it as simple as possible. And this is a quote that I love. So let's dive into it. Before I can present on anything, I think it's always important to understand principles, heuristics, and methods. Principles to me is, ultimately, what are we trying to do with interventions that we have? I'm trying to distill.
All right, guys, come on.
Oh, we got something crazy going in the background. Okay. We're going back at it. So with principles, I'm trying to distill everything that we're doing down to the simplest explanation based on the rules and the laws that govern our world. So what must be fundamentally true? If I'm looking at, a different school of thought, another like 3-letter certification course, they might be doing a lot of different interventions and have certain rationales behind what they're doing. But if I have principles, I don't have to attach my interventions based to their narratives. I can do it under a different scope, and I can still use their tools or their exercises. Heuristics are just a framework that helps you produce solutions, and it's usually cultivated through emerging evidence, the literature that we read, and the experiences that we have. For me, it's not always about being right all of the time. It's about creating these models or frameworks that are right 80 to 90% of the time, because that's going to help us save time, and it's going to be less cognitively demanding, right? Like if I see someone and I keep seeing these patterns kind of come up and I have to rethink that process every single time, it's going to be exhausting. So to me, a heuristics is what works most of the time within this given context in front of you. And then the last thing is going to be a method, a thought or a behavior that's utilized to accomplish a particular task or an approach to a particular situation. To me, methods is what tools do you have for the job? Methods are what you do. Principles and heuristics will help you identify why and how you do it. And now we're going to kind of start to dive into what are my principles. So feel free to take this. It's definitely been inspired by other people. I don't think this is very unique. I'm just trying to figure out, whenever I'm working with someone, what do I have to accomplish in order to have a very complete treatment? My first principle is going to be movement, availability, and isolation. How can I get this person to express, ranges of motion that might be currently limited at a specific joint or a specific muscle? And then that kind of bleeds into principle number 2, which is going to be movement, availability, and integration. So it's great that I get things in isolation. I maybe change, external rotation, but how does that look when I get someone to press again? Or if I improve someone's hip internal rotation and, that person might have had pinchy hips during a squat, does that squat improve? So for me, it's got to have carryover and isolation to carry over into integration. Principle number 3 is optimization of energy transfer. When we talk about energy transfer, I'm thinking more so plyometrics, right? Can someone handle a high eccentric force, go through that amortization period and reproduce force again to redirect them somewhere else? Principle number 4, optimization of energy expenditure. This is thinking more so from an energy system standpoint. Does this person have the metabolic efficiency to meet the demands of their goals and their lifestyle? Principle number 5, graded exposure. How can I get someone from a very controlled, low stress environment to a very chaotic, high stress environment? Bridging that gap from, a body weight squat to being able to do continuous jumps to being able to get back to your sport. And that's, to me, is probably one of the most important principles, because if you do that, right, gradually expose someone to the demands of their goals, you're going to get them back to doing what they love. And for me, you don't have to be married to a lot of these different schools of thoughts. You can just start to think, okay, when I'm applying this intervention, it's this amount of stress. A logical progression would provide a similar stress to the same joints and the body parts here. And then I have these stepping stones that I'm going to take to get someone to higher function. Principle number 6, navigate variability in task and environmental constraints. I want to make sure that this person can get the job done, not just in front of me in like a very controlled setting. There's a lot of times I think where people do a lot of these rehearsed movements. They do like a lateral shuffle and then they go into a sprint. If they can only do it when they know exactly where they're going and when they're going to do it, they're going to be in for a rude awakening when they go back to sport and it's not a controlled movement anymore. They've got to make it very reaction, and you've got to be able to test people and get them to problem solve on the fly. So instead of maybe starting with like a lateral shuffle to an acceleration, we're going to progress that to, now I'm not going to let you know when you're going to, which side you're going to shuffle to. You might shuffle to the left and excel. You might shuffle to the right and excel. And then I might scale that to, now you're just going to guard me and try to pass me. Principle number 7, behavior change. This is ultimately what we're always trying to do. Doesn't matter if you're a physical therapist, a group instructor, personal trainer, S&C coach, chiropractor, we're trying to influence people's behaviors. And this isn't just like, physical behaviors, but mental ones as well. From a pain science lens, if someone has unhelpful thoughts about their body, narratives about, their ability to heal and adapt, we're trying to change those mental behaviors. And sometimes we might leverage physical behaviors to show them that, right? If we can scale our training and our interventions to get them to do things they couldn't do before, then you can also see some mental changes there. So these are my principles. Feel free to take them, modify them. But whenever I'm learning something, and then whenever I'm working with somebody, I'm thinking about all 7 of these. Now we're going to go into a framework for making decisions, heuristics. This is one of the heuristics that I use. Does this person have movement tolerance versus workload tolerance? And I like to use the traffic light analogy. I used to put numbers behind this, like, hey, if you have less than 4 out of 10 pain, it's a green light. If it's 4 to 6, then it's yellow light. And if it's more than 6, it's red light. But I've encountered a lot of people that I work with that have had persistent pain, and they'll tell me, my baseline's 8 out of 10 pain or 10 out of 10 pain. And I realized, like, the traffic light analogy, even though there's a lot of good research with the numerical values, it just wasn't accounting for actual human experiences. So I say, if it's a green light, it's either baseline or there's no pain, meaning your pain stayed the same or there's no pain at all with the movement. And that's okay with me. You're good there. Yellow light is tolerable discomfort. So it might be worse than baseline, but it's tolerable for you. And then red light, it's intolerable discomfort. And for me, if it's green light, we're good to go. Yellow light, it's a maybe. If it's a red light, it's a no for now. And now here's where we start to use these tactics, right, to make decisions. Movement tolerance. If it's a same day tolerance, if it's a same day green light, then you get clearance for that. You're good to go. If it's the same day yellow light, there's going to be certain times where this will vary for me. If it's the first session that I'm seeing that person, I don't want to poke the bear too much. I want to create a baseline assessment of where they're at. And then if we have subsequent successful sessions, let's say it's like the 4th or 5th session, and they've been tolerating the training really well, then I might go into a yellow light, given that they're not really stressed out that day. And, they're not like lifestyle factors like sleep and stuff are kind of okay. Then we might poke the bear a little bit. but I don't want to risk going into a yellow light if it's one of my first or second time seeing this person. I'm trying to build trust. And there's always options to move in a green light so that you don't always have to go into yellow light. Red light, we just avoid for now. And the way I kind of communicate this is, if we stay in the green and in yellow, the reds will eventually be yellow and the yellows will eventually be green. And for me, it's always about having a logical progression of stress, which is why we're here today, is developing a model of movement so that we can understand what's a logical progression of stress. So hold on, I just want to check the chat. All right. Any questions about anything so far, guys? I know 2 people joined while we started. Feel free to hit the chat button to ask a question. And we're going to go into functional movement patterns. And I call these the methods, because for me, these are just tools to get the job done. And these are the squat, the hinge, push, pull, carry, lunge, sprint, throw, jump, lateral shuffle, lateral run, back pedal, and hip turn. You'll commonly see the shirts and people say, like, everyone has to squat, hinge, push, pull, carry, lunge, but there's so many other movements that encapsulate people's goals, like sprinting, throwing, jumping, shuffling, back pedal, hip turning, changing a direction, that if we can get people back to these fundamental movement patterns and have a progression and regression for everything, then we can slowly see how we're going to get someone from low function to high performance. So now we're going into a scalable training solution. This is what we call vertical intensive plyometrics. I classify plyometrics depending on the direction that you're going and also the intensity of it. If it's something that you can recreate that output for a long duration of time, it's going to be an extensive plyometric. If it's something where you can only reproduce that same effort for a short amount of reps, it's going to be an intensive plyometric. So I wanted to give you guys an example of how I kind of think things through so that you can walk away here with something tangible, but also start to apply this into your own thinking. So for vertical intensive plyometrics, progressions and regressions, there's 3 ways to start. I'll be honest, I only go with the depth drops now because I find that the depth drop squats and box jumps, it kind of doesn't resonate with me as much. But let's say I'm trying to prepare somebody to jump. We can go into a drop squat, which is you're going to get up on your toes and then you're going to drop down into a squat and hold that position. What I didn't like is that there's not a lot of displacement. Your foot doesn't really leave the ground. And to me, I would rather provide an exercise where your foot actually leaves the ground and it mimics that eccentric demand of a jump. The box jump, you can jump onto a higher box so that when you're landing, it's less vertical displacement and impact on the joints. And over time, you would jump on a lower box so that there's more impact when you land. For me, I use a depth drop, and that's jumping off of an elevated surface and then just sticking the position. That's going to mimic the lowering eccentric part of the jump more so than a box jump and a drop squat. Because drop squat, it's not really scalable, right? You could drop faster, but there's only so much you can do when your foot doesn't leave the ground. A box jump, I think, gets a little bit awkward because you have to produce force to get to that higher box before you scale it down to a lower box. To me, a depth drop is you could just step up to a box, jump off of it and stick it. And then you can either scale the box up or you can scale the box down. And depending on the person's prior level of function, you have an idea of how high of a box you need to get to before you go into the next movement, which is a non-counter movement jump. So now when you're thinking about plyometrics, we're thinking about how much force the body has to tolerate. If there's more momentum with the initiation, you're going to be able to jump higher. If you're able to jump higher, your body has to tolerate more stress when it lands. So one of the ways we progress vertical intensive plyometrics is with the initiation. I'm going to give you less momentum so you can't jump that high. But I know if you can tolerate that stress, then I can give you more momentum so that you can get a little bit more stress to the system. Because if we keep doing the same thing, we're not going to develop an adaptation. So that movement, a non-counter movement jump, we stay at the bottom of a squat, and then you jump, and then you stick the bottom again. There's less momentum. And if you bridge the gap with that, you can go into a counter movement jump, which is now you're coming from the top, swinging the arms down, coming up, and sticking the landing. And then you're going to reset at the top every single time. We can go over some of the movement progressions and regressions after the presentation, and I'll show you guys what it feels like. Then we go into a double contact jump. So a double contact jump, you're going to jump, you're going to add a little bit of a bounce and jump again, add a little bit of bounce, jump again. That extra bounce helps dissipate some stress before going into something like a continuous jump, which is just, you're just jumping up and down, and you're trying to get as high as you can with each jump. Last progression is going to be a depth jump, which is you're jumping off of a box and then coming straight up and sticking it. Now, within all of these variations, you can not only just jump up and down, you could jump forward, you could jump side to side, you can make it single leg, you can make it rotational. It's so interchangeable based on the demands of the person that you're working with and where they're at. So that's what I really like about having these progressions and regressions, is because if I know someone can do a depth drop, I already know that I can eventually get them to a depth jump, because the human body is so predictable. If I give it an appropriate amount of stress, it's going to create an adaptation over time. And then when it creates that adaptation over time, I know the interventions or exercises I was using before won't do me any good, because your body's already got accommodated to that stress, and I need to progress it. Now, having a scalable training solution is super important, because if you know what your target muscles are, then you know exactly whether or not someone is kind of performing and feeling in the right positions. If the target muscles for jumps, they're probably going to be quads and glutes. If someone's doing a bunch of jumps and they're like, I'm getting achiness in my knee joint, or, when I jump, I feel like my QL feels kind of jacked up, or when I land, I feel like my Achilles really, really sore, like pressure there. Well, if you know what target muscles you're after, then you don't have to stick with that movement. You can regress the movement to the point where they feel those target muscles working. And now you have a way to make decisions, because you're not just relying on blindly following something. You're like, okay, I've started someone at a non-counter movement jump. They felt it in their legs. Everything felt good. We progressed the stress into a counter movement jump, but now instead of feeling it in their legs, they feel it in their back. So for the next, 2 weeks, we'll do non-counter movement jumps, wait for them to get acclimated to that stress, and then progress the movement. And then within that target muscle thought process is you have common compensations with each movement. If I go into a jump and I get a lot of lumbar extension opposed to loading into my hips during the eccentric portion of the jump, you might see someone, complain of like pinchiness in the front, or even discomfort of the lower back during that movement. And from a joint kinematic standpoint, if I'm going for the jump and I want to see almost equal movement or knee bend at the knee and in my torso at the same time. If I get minimal bend in my knee and I just get a lot of movement in my torso, I'm probably utilizing different movement strategies. And it's not that it's a bad thing, but if we have a certain idea of what we want the movement patterns to look like, or standards, then we can make better decisions of whether or not they've acquired that movement skill before progressing it. So we'll talk about the torso excursion and lower extremity joint excursion during the Q&A when we get through the movements. And then having a criteria to progress. Accumulate desired volume. Goal is at least 3 to 5 sets of 5 to 6 jumps, 2 to 3 times per week, depending on the person you're working with, for at least 2 to 4 weeks before progressing to the next pattern. And other criteria to progress is going to be obviously tolerance to training. So within all of those foundational movement patterns that we talked about, you can create a scalable training solution and a model for movement to make better decisions just by implementing this. So we go into how to develop a model. You have to think about progressions and regressions based on fundamental sciences such as physics and biomechanics, because they kind of govern the way we move, the way our body interacts with forces. And if we don't take those things into consideration, we're probably not going to have a great model for progressing and regressing our clients. Understanding what target muscles you want that person to be feeling. And this isn't always super, super important, but you have to have an idea of where that stress is being placed. And if people keep saying, oh, I'm feeling in my back whenever I jump, you can't just be like, yeah, technique doesn't matter, and It's all in your head, just load it. No, you still want a standard of where you should be feeling the muscles. And sometimes not feeling anything is okay, as long as they're not feeling in areas that were previously symptomatic. Common compensations, you need to have a standard of what this movement looks like. And not every single person is going to fit that standard, but you have to think about what's an acceptable amount of deviation from that standard. I think an easy way to think about this is, if you take an Olympic sprinter, their sprinting is going to look so much different than someone that might be a hockey player or someone that might play lacrosse, where there's a lot of lateral movements. Because if you keep moving laterally side to side, you're going to develop certain muscular biases and joint biases that would just change the way you move. Likewise, if you're sprinting with a lacrosse stick, it's going to change the way you sprint. So you don't always have to have someone look exactly like that standard, but you should have a standard in mind so that they can be maybe within one standard deviation away from it, and two in the very extreme cases, and you probably don't want that much deviation from it if it's like 3 standard deviations. And if you do this with every functional movement pattern, then you've got a scalable plan to someone's goals. Because if you can, there's not a single goal that you can't get back to if they do all of those patterns, right? If they get to those patterns, even in the most regressed way, you know that you have these scalable options to get them to higher performance. There's not a single sport that doesn't take all of those things into consideration. So the importance of doing so, you create a thought process that helps you navigate information overload. There's not a shortage of cases, right? I mean, not shortage of cases, shortage of continuing education courses. There's so much information out there. I'm the best system. This is the way to do it. You should avoid supinating. You should avoid pronating. This is the only way to lift. This is the correct way. And all of these people are probably seeing some sort of success, but they're probably also seeing some sort of failure as well, right? And as human beings, we just tend to have a lot of bias. We don't remember the people that we failed, and we just remember all of the people that we helped. So someone that, says maybe pronation is the demon and it'll ruin your foot and everything up the chain, they probably will help certain people that are very biased to the opposite side of the spectrum, that are very supinated. Likewise, if someone says you always have to have an arch and you have to always be able to supinate, they probably help people that are very pronated. We have these people on extremes pitching that their ideas are right, and they're going to definitely help people that are on the opposite side of the spectrum, but they don't take into account the people that are on that same fence that they're in, that already have the same tools that they have, and they don't account for those human beings. So for me, you have to be able to think outside the box, understand what your principles are, understand what kind of tactical frameworks and heuristics you have, and then the tools you can learn from anybody. You can learn from an FRC, PRI, any school of thought. Just take what they do and distill it down to your principles and plug it into your own framework. Whenever you have someone that you can't help, then you update your framework to account for that. If you don't have a model, then you don't have standardization, which is very simple. If you don't have standards, then you're not going to be able to make really clear decisions. I always say, what's an acceptable amount of variation versus what's too much deviation? How do I know if it's safe? When should I progress or regress? If you have no thought process of how to, increase stress over time, then you're not going to be able to help people, because you're not going to be able to communicate how they're going to go from a calf raise back to running, or how they're going to be able to go from a push-up back to throwing. There's a progression and regression for everything. And if you understand and you have a model to communicate that and do it with all your clients with, you're going to see a lot of success. But if you're trying to rethink every single situation, it's just going to be too cognitively demanding. And for me, you're going to be wasting a lot of time if instead of having like an actual framework with actual tactics that you can implement right away that can account for 80 to 90%. And for the 10 to 20% that it doesn't account for, at least you have the thought process on how to actively problem solve to get those solutions. So this goes to last quote for the day. Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, and tactics without strategy is noise before defeat. To me, strategy is principles and heuristics, and tactics are tools. So if you have principles and heuristics, but you have no tools to get the job done, you might still win. It's just going to take you a long time. But if you have the right tools for the job, you can get it done very quickly. tactics without strategy is noise before defeat. If you just learn a bunch of exercises, but you have no heuristics or principles to really think about how you're gonna scale this from low function to high performance, you're just gonna be doing a bunch of things before you realize it's not working. So this is a quote from Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I really love all of his thought processes and philosophies about preparation, and I take it into account a lot with my own framework. So we're gonna go into the Q&A. Appreciate you guys for tuning in, and I'll take any questions that you guys have, and we'll go through some movements if you guys are interested. Let me stop. 30 minutes. How was that? Any questions about anything?
I got a question,
Fred?
if I can. So in terms of, the specific movements that you were talking about, so sprinting, for example, and when you said like study what it should look like, so we have like a baseline of what we're gonna teach our patients, how would you recommend going about that? I've had some mentors tell me like look up the pros, like the best sprinters in the world, the best squatters in the world, the best pitchers in the world, study how they move, and then kind of develop something based off of that. But how would you recommend learning those movements?
For sure, that's a great question. I take into consideration something called attractors and fluctuators. So there's going to be some variation within different athletes, and that's going to be the fluctuators, things that can be variable and change between individuals. But there's going to be something called attractors, which is something you'll see almost consistently throughout every athlete. So there might be, like, one of the things I like to think about, Franz Bosch talks about this, but it's called a hip lock. You'll always see someone in a stance-like position and the other leg swinging through. On that stance leg, that pelvis is going to be lower, and the swing through, that pelvis is going to be higher. So if someone's going through some locomotor drills and you see that they take a step on the left leg, and instead of that hip going lower, it stays higher or leveled, then it's going to be like, man, that's not that hip lock position that we see when people change directions or perform locomotor drills. I've got to scale that intervention back. Maybe they can capture that hip lock position with a march, but they can't get it quite yet with a skip. So I'm going to stick with the marches now. And then once they get it down with the skips, then we can start progressing to our different tiers of A running. Or maybe you're going through, let's say the positions like A march to A skip, and you see that their single leg calf raises are significantly different side to side. Then it's like, okay, if that side can do 15 more calf raises, I can see why that hip's dropping. It can't account for the forces on the ground. So you have an idea in your head of kind of what might be causing this issue, and an intervention that might help alleviate that situation. But to answer your question, not go on a ramble, is kind of taking into consideration what are the commonalities between people that are successful, and then making sure that that shows up within the clients that you're working with.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. I just got his book, so I guess I'll learn about that as I read it.
It's a great book. Franz Bosch is definitely ahead of his time, but I love that he talks about certain attractors that he looks for. Let's go, Evan.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Any questions, guys? Let me know.
When thinking about your common compensations, how are you determining what is a positive versus a negative compensation, right? Because all athletes are great compensators, and some of them, the compensation is actually what's driving their success. Like somebody may have really stiff ankles, looks ugly when they're doing basic motions, but that springiness that they're getting out of it is what's actually allowing them to affect the movements that they're seeing on the pitch or on the field or on the court, whatever it be. So how are we knowing what we should be or should not be targeting, and what's their positive adaptations?
I love it, Paul. Thank you for that question. One thing to always take into consider is going to be mechanism of injury and previous injury history. So if they had a lot of, let's say for me, I'm looking to see like, if there's someone that's dealing with like lots of Achilles tendonitis issues, And there's not, the stiffness is definitely one component that's going to help improve performance, but range of motion and other things can help distribute the stress more. So for me, like a positive or like a good compensation can also lead to certain things providing more stress to the same areas, because athletes are really good at just compensating, but also getting the job done with less tools. So giving them more tools, giving them a little bit more variability so that they can distribute the stress to a bigger range is going to help them, stay healthier. Other things for me to consider are going to be like kinematics, right? I think the easiest way to see it is like, if I'm working with an athlete and let's say we're training and they're coming to me with an episode of low back pain, and then they squat like this, where they're getting a lot of more torso excursion opposed to lower extremity excursion. I know the dorsal excursion is going to be biasing the lower back extensors a little bit more. And if there's someone that's coming with me for, lower back tightness or pain there, then I think having a heels elevated variation where they can get more lower extremity excursion and less from the torso can recreate what we consider to be a more optimal squat pattern. But I'm also considering that where I'm trying to place the stress is going to be the legs and less of the lower back.
So you're looking at through a constraints model based off of the injuries and how do I constrain the movement to give greater affordances for that movement profile within that individual, trying to offload some stress into where they may have some niggles or some injury or prior injury.
Exactly. I think there's a finite amount of capacity in a given day that if you're using similar strategies for everything that you're doing, you're going to exceed that capacity. But I always say finite within that given day because that capacity could be changing day to day, especially when you're creating adaptation. But with someone that is sensitive or currently rehabbing an injury, that capacity might be lower. So we might just be working around that injury and finding ways to load that'll create less stress there. And what I like to think about it is like the signal and the noise. If I'm trying to stress a particular movement pattern, like if I'm using a squat, for instance, I'm trying to build more lower extremity strength. So I want to see more excursion at the lower extremity opposed to having more noise happening from the lower back. Paul, we're going to have some good discussions in this next quarter.
I don't know if I'm sorry, if I fully understand. Sorry for the bad quality here. But let's say you have somebody, let's say you have an athlete coming in with some Achilles problems, let's like tendonitis or something. Would you start locally then? Like you do some low and slow or like the Alfredson's protocol or something like that. But then you look at the different patterns that is needed for their sport. Maybe they can't do any jumping, sprinting, shuffling right now, but then you start with a squat progression. You see where they're at, how they're moving, and then a lunge, a hip hinge, something like that. And then you add the sprinting, you add the jumping, and you progress from there. Is that would that be some kind of framework for that?
I think that's definitely a framework. For me, there's no one right way to do things. I like to think of it from locally, like what's happening there, but also from a global perspective, right? With Achilles tendonitis, what you'll see is, let's say someone's center of gravity is really shifted forward and there's a lot of pressure on their forefoot. If there's a lot of pressure on their forefoot and their center of gravity is really shifted forward, there's always going to be a lot of tension at the Achilles and their strategies are going to manifest that way. At the same time, I know that you also have to stress the area locally. I'd rather not think of it as a black and white situation and think of it as like, okay, why does this area have so much stress there in the first place? And that's more so like a global perspective, but I also take a local perspective to it is like, how can we improve the tolerance to stress in that area? So you can go through different thought processes from a movement progression and regression framework. I like to think I want to make sure there's no elephants in a room is what I say. If there's a significant ankle mobility restriction side to side, or maybe tibia internal rotation, like if you look at someone's knee bend and it's significantly worse on one side and it happens to be the affected side, or the internal rotation at the same side is really limited, and they can't, manifest or create a strategy or express movement that offloads it, then I'm going to address those elephants in a room while still stressing it locally. Because I think we're always going to operate with the tools that we have. And if there are certain movements that are coupled from a gait perspective, from a functional movement perspective, then I need to make sure that they have access to those positions as well. But then again, I think what always gets lost is people say, like, if you treat the site of the symptoms, I forget the quote, like, you're missing out on the true root cause. There's no root cause. There's only just potential contributors, and you're going to want to make sure you're addressing all the potential contributors.
Sounds like a little bit what Greg Lehman calls comprehensive capacity, right? So we'll see if we work the whole athlete, they get better, and maybe we do some local stuff as well, and we'll see what happens and how we can progress them.
Yeah, exactly. There's going to be certain things that you'll want to track over time. And for me, we call those key performance indicators. If I'm tracking those objectives over time and their symptoms are getting better and their functions getting better, then I'm on the right track. But if I'm tracking those things over time and they're getting better, but the symptoms and the functions aren't improving in the grand scheme of things, right? In the first 4 weeks or so, nothing. You might get some changes here and there, but in like 6 to 8 weeks, if the KPIs are changing and their functions changing, good stuff. KPIs changing, function and stuff hasn't really changed, we've got to look elsewhere. So that's the thought process there, is we can create comprehensive capacity, and that's good. I definitely, love that thought process, but we also have to figure out how we're going to measure success over time. And there might be something we're missing down the line if that doesn't help improve it. And that's kind of what I've realized, or what I've been trying to figure out the past 2 years, is like, whenever I run into a problem I can't solve, I need to figure out how to solve it. And I need to learn from people that are getting those kind of results that I'm not getting.
So in your development of your KPIs, are we looking at standardized tests? And then what's the driver for that KPI? So like, say we're doing something agility wise on 505, so we're doing whatever that is. Are we doing that as a baseline standardization? Or are we looking at the athlete and going, here's what you need to be able to compete at? And do we have enough objective data of what a starter wing in a soccer league may need to be able to do on that test, so that we know that he's competitive? You know what I'm saying? I mean, some of these KPIs may be very local to us, right? And we have some aspects, but like, if you talk about with like Rob Panarello, he's like, it's not returning them just to play, it's returning them actually to play, which means they have to be able to compete against the athlete that's in front of them now. And how are we getting ready to compete against that athlete? Because if most of our metrics are to a norm, we're talking about people that are abnormal humans, right? So we're not trying to get to the peak, we're shifting everything right on that curve, not trying to find the peak of the curve, right? So how do we know that we've got good data that helps us move them that way?
Love it. I don't think, one, to answer your question, like there's one heuristic that I like to use. It's called, I just think of it like this. It's variability versus adaptability. If someone's coming to me with a tissue insult that's compromised the tissue integrity, traumatic injury, then if I focus on variability, I'm doing that person a disservice. They need to create an adaptation. They need to get stronger and start to meet the demands of their lifestyle. Whereas if someone's coming to me for persistent pain and it's been years and years and years, they might need more variability because they might be predisposing themselves to very similar strategies. So that's one way to think about it, right? Having certain range of motion measures, having certain capacity screens that might be, to what you said, like a more standardized norm. But then also thinking to, when you're covering those functional movement patterns, can that person do it at the speed that they're going to experience it within their sport? And if they can they do it with the cognitive demands that they're going to be experiencing in their sport? So there's no real KPI besides actually doing the thing that actually matters. But there's going to be KPIs that we need to track. Like, I can't expect this person to be able to cut and do a lot of these movements aggressive side to side if they can only hold a Copenhagen above their knee. because I know that stress is going to be placed somewhere because they got to be able to decelerate, plant, and do all of these things. So I want to see in that instance, someone can hold a Copenhagen and do it eccentrically from their ankle before introducing maybe some more lateral intensive movements, or maybe we do the lateral movements at a slower rate as we build up that adductor strength. But the thought process is going to be kind of like, I can't imagine you being successful from a physical and mental standpoint if you haven't been able to accomplish these KPIs. And if we can accomplish this, then it's my most risk adverse assessment of you being able to safely return to what you want to do. And there's going to be some limitations and things that we can't account for that we'll always have to update. But for me, I'm always thinking to myself, like, okay, so-and-so is a volleyball player, and volleyball players take over 100 jump contacts, per match. If they haven't done a jump, I can't expect them to be it. So I know we have to build up ground contacts. Other things are going to be like just general lower extremity strength. If she's coming in, if a volleyball player is coming to me and she can only goblet squat maybe, 35 pounds, there might not be any normative values on these things. Well, there is some, right? Like I think it's 1.2 or 1.4 times your body weight to reduce lower extremity strength with the barbell squat.
Yeah, 1.6 for a female. Yeah.
But all that, 1.6 and 2 for a male.
Yeah.
But all that's really saying is you got to get your legs stronger to meet because if they did the same thing with a rear foot elevated split squat or a skater squat, you'll probably see similar results. So there's got to be some sort of a thought process with from a skill standpoint, from a, tendon, musculoskeletal standpoint, from a cognitive standpoint, and just making sure that you're covering as many bases as possible before.
All right. So your KPIs are your kind of minimal threshold for moving to the next level, and or saying that, okay, we've got a minimal competency to where I feel comfortable allowing you to return to sport, but I can't recreate sport. Only sport can recreate sport. So we may start building in small side gains and some of these other kind of things to get them ready for sport until they're ready to go to full sport. Is that kind of your thought process? We're going to check all those boxes along the way.
Yep.
All right.
Paul, you got the hardest questions.
It's because I'm old.
NG, sorry, I'm not sure if it's Ing or your initials. You asked any resources on learning more of the movement / training side of things, plyos, training principles. Plyos, a good start is Derek Hansen has a book called Plyometric Anatomy that he has, and he talks about the benefits of certain plyometric exercise. Exos has a good baseline framework of like how to implement these sporting movements that I really like. Lee Taff, multi-directional speed. No one's going to be better than Lee Taff. Derek Hansen's great for sprinting and acceleration. Very simplified, but very effective. And he's worked with the highest performance, out of most S&C coaches that we know. He's with Kansas City, and they won the Super Bowl, fastest team in the league. So those are definitely some people that I would look towards for learning those kind of things. All right, guys, I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to stick around if you guys have any questions. And yeah, appreciate you guys for tuning in on a Sunday.